had never expected to find it, but there it was, small and unnoticed at first, like a blip in a perfectly normal evening. I was folding his shirts, something I did on autopilot, when I saw it. A stain, a blot of red lipstick. Not too large, but unmistakable against the pale fabric of his white shirt. My fingers froze mid-fold, pressing gently into the fabric. I hadn't been snooping. I hadn't been searching for anything out of place. It was just an accident, one of those things that comes at you when you least expect it. The shirt was hanging there, waiting to be put back in the closet, and there it was. A sign. Or at least, that's what it felt like. It wasn't about the stain itself. It wasn't about the color or the size. It was about the knowing. A sudden, undeniable understanding that something had changed. It was like a door had creaked open, and now I couldn't pretend it was still closed. He didn't know I saw it yet. He didn't know I knew, but the fact was, I did. I stood there for longer than I should have, staring at it, wondering if I was imagining it, wondering if I had been too wrapped up in the noise of my own mind to notice what was right in front of me. A thought flickered briefly. Should I ask him? Should I say something? Maybe confront him, demand an explanation? The possibility hovered in the air, but I didn't let it take root. I wasn't angry, not yet anyway. I didn't want to be. The anger could come later. The disappointment could come later. I just wanted to wait. So, I folded the shirt, just like I had before, just like nothing had changed, just like nothing was wrong. And then I put it away, right back where it had been, beside the others, so carefully organized, so perfectly normal. But I knew that I had just crossed a line in my own mind, that something had shifted, and now I couldn't unsee it. The question wasn't if it mattered anymore, but how it would matter moving forward. How long could I pretend I hadn't seen it? How long could I let this lie rest between us, unspoken, until it finally became something we couldn't ignore? I didn't know the answer, but for now, I did the only thing I could do. I carried on. I didn't ask him about it. I didn't mention it. Not even when we spoke later that night, sitting across from each other in the living room, the weight of unspoken words between us, thickening the air. It wasn't time to talk about it. Not yet. So, I let it be. I let him think everything was fine. But inside, I was already preparing for the shift. The next morning, everything felt different. It wasn't the kind of different you could pinpoint right away, but it was there, like a low hum just beneath the surface. A shift in the air, the way you feel before a storm breaks, though the sky is still clear. I could see him getting ready for work, moving through the motions like he always did, but there was a tension now, something between us that hadn't been there the night before. The lipstick stain still lingered in my mind, a constant reminder, but I didn't mention it. I hadn't planned on mentioning it. Instead, I just watched him. He brushed his teeth, rifled through his clothes, the usual routine. But everything felt like it was happening through a filter, like I was observing it from somewhere just outside of myself, detached but very present. I couldn't help but wonder if he felt it too. The change. Or maybe he was just oblivious, as he always was, living his life with that same carefree certainty that things would always be fine, that they always had been. But for me, the ground had shifted, and I couldn't go back to how things were before. I don't know why I waited. Maybe it was because I didn't want to lose my grip. Confronting him, asking him outright about the stain, about the possibility of another woman. What good would it do? Would it change anything? Would he admit to it? Or would he lie, smooth it over with an excuse, another excuse to keep the peace, to keep everything comfortable? No, I couldn't confront him yet. Not like that. I found myself waiting, not knowing for what. Maybe I was waiting for him to crack, for him to slip up and say something that would make it all real, make it all undeniable. Maybe I was waiting for a sign from him, some moment of guilt or confession, something that would make it easier for me to walk away. But deep down, I knew that wasn't how it worked. I watched him leave that morning, as I always did, and the weight in my chest grew heavier. He didn't know I was waiting. He didn't know anything had changed. But I did. And that was the worst part. Knowing something was wrong, but not being able to name it, not being able to confront it head on. It wasn't just about the lipstick stain anymore. It was about everything that came before and everything that might come after. It was about the choices we'd made, both of us, and how we'd let them pile up, unnoticed, until they finally began to fall apart. I went through the day like I always did. Work, errands, pretending everything was normal, but I felt like I was living in two worlds. The one where nothing had changed, and the one where everything was different, where every small detail felt like it was weighted with meaning, like a metaphor for the life we were both pretending to live. The apartment felt too quiet. The silence stretched longer than usual, but even so, I didn't pick up the phone to call him. I didn't send a text asking when he'd be home. I just moved through my day, my mind constantly circling back to that lipstick stain. It wasn't even the color that caught my attention. It was the fact that it was there at all. It was the first tangible proof of something I had only felt until now. The first thing I could touch and hold, even if it was nothing but a mark on a shirt. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to say anything, because saying it would make it real, wouldn't it? If I said it aloud, if I forced him to admit it, then there'd be no turning back. And maybe I wasn't ready for that yet. By the time the evening came, the hours felt stretched thin, like I was watching the day through a veil. I was waiting for something, him to slip up, to let something out, or for him to notice that I wasn't pretending anymore. But he didn't. He came home, late as usual, and still, no mention of it. The lipstick, the stain, the unspoken truth, nothing. I went to bed that night without a word, the space between us larger than it had ever been. I could hear him breathing beside me, the steady rise and fall of his chest. But I didn't touch him. I didn't want to. I wasn't ready to confront him yet. I was still waiting, but for what? For him to change? For me to change? Or maybe for something to crack open and reveal what we had both been too afraid to admit? Whatever it was, I couldn't say. But I was done pretending. The game had changed, and I wasn't going to keep playing by the same rules anymore. Not when the lipstick had already spoken louder than either of us ever had. The morning came too quickly, like it always does when you're not ready for it, when you're caught in the fog of something you can't name. I woke up to the same silence, the same hum in the air, but today it felt different, somehow more final. I turned over to find the space beside me empty. He'd already left, quietly, as he always did when he was in a rush. Never even a goodbye. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything settling on me in a way I couldn't ignore. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, the distant noise of traffic, and for a moment, it felt like the world was going on as usual. But not for me. Not anymore. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, then swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My feet touched the cool wood floor, and for some reason the sound of them landing on the ground was sharper than I remembered. It was like I was aware of every little movement, every shift in the air. The apartment, the space we'd shared for so long, felt too quiet, almost hollow. It was as if I was the only one left in it, even though I knew I wasn't. But the emptiness inside me felt louder than the physical emptiness of the room. The first thing I did was check my phone. No missed calls, no messages, nothing. I tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest, the tight knot that had become all too familiar. I wasn't sure why I was looking for something, anything, from him. I had nothing to say, no reason to reach out, but I checked anyway. I went to the bathroom to wash my face. The mirror reflected the same face I'd seen every day, but today, it seemed unfamiliar, like a stranger looking back at me. My eyes felt heavy, tired, like I hadn't slept at all, even though I had. I stared at myself for a moment, trying to find the version of me that existed before all of this started. But she was gone. She wasn't here anymore. The day was already slipping away from me, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. I felt like I was on the edge of something, standing at the precipice of a decision I hadn't quite made yet. I couldn't go on like this, waiting for him to mess up, waiting for him to admit whatever I already knew. But I wasn't ready to let go of everything either. The apartment, the life we'd built together, it was still mine, wasn't it? Even if he didn't see me anymore, even if he couldn't admit that something was wrong. I moved through the motions of the day, the routine that had become so automatic it didn't require any thought, but it felt off. I was going through the motions, but wasn't really living them. I picked up a book I'd been reading, but the words didn't make sense. I brewed coffee, but it didn't taste right. I went through my emails, but none of it mattered. Nothing mattered. Not in the way it used to. At some point, I found myself standing in front of the kitchen window, staring out at the street below. The world outside seemed unaffected by everything that was happening inside me. Cars passed by. People went about their day, unaware of the turmoil in the apartment above. It felt like I was disconnected from it all, like I was on the outside, watching my own life unfold through a screen, unable to reach in and change anything. Then, my eyes landed on the sticky note I had left on the mirror the night before. It was still there, in its exact spot. The simple words, "Your turn to start over," glaring at me, as if taunting me. I didn't know what I expected from it, maybe some clarity, maybe some courage, but it only made things worse. It was too final, too sharp. There was no going back once those words were out there. I felt a rush of anger, frustration rising in my chest. He hadn't even noticed. He hadn't even cared. I hadn't told him what was wrong, hadn't given him a chance to explain, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was nothing left to explain. The lipstick, the silence, the way things had changed. He knew. He had to know. And if he didn't, then maybe it didn't matter. Maybe I was already done. I went to the living room, pacing back and forth, fighting the urge to grab my phone and call him, to demand that he come home and talk to me. But I knew better. I wasn't going to beg him for answers. I wasn't going to sit there and listen to more excuses. He had his chance, and now it was my turn. I stopped pacing and looked around the room at the life we'd shared. The apartment wasn't much, but it had been ours. It had been enough, or so I had told myself. But now, standing here in the quiet, it felt like nothing. All the things we had, our routines, our shared moments, the love we had once felt, it was gone. It was already slipping through my fingers, and I couldn't hold on anymore. I didn't want to wait for him any longer. I didn't want to pretend anymore. I wasn't going to be the one left behind, not when I knew the truth. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking slightly, and grabbed the car keys from the counter. The world outside was waiting, and I needed to face it, head on. I drove aimlessly for a while, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than I'd intended, my thoughts spiraling in 1,000 different directions. It was like I was in a daze, watching everything around me pass by in slow motion, feeling disconnected from the world, but somehow hyper-aware of every little detail. The streets looked the same shops, the same people walking by, heads down, lost in their own worlds. But for me, everything had changed. It was as if the fabric of my reality had been torn, and no matter how much I wanted to sew it back together, the pieces wouldn't fit anymore. I found myself parked at a cafe, one we'd gone to a few times, not far from our apartment. It had always been one of those places where we could be alone together, tucked in a quiet corner, with no one bothering us. But today, sitting there, it felt strange. It felt like a memory from someone else's life. I stared at the menu. Even though I had no intention of ordering anything, my mind kept drifting back to the note on the mirror. "Your turn to start over." It kept echoing in my head, over and over like a chant. But I wasn't sure what it meant anymore. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with those words. Had I really meant them? Or had I just been angry, reacting to something I couldn't control? I sipped my coffee, the bitter taste lingering on my tongue, but I barely noticed. I was too focused on the noise in my head, the whirlwind of emotions that had no clear shape, no clear direction. Part of me wanted to call him. Part of me wanted to go home and confront him, to make him see what he had done. But another part of me knew that wasn't the answer. Confrontation wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't bring back what we had, or what we'd lost. I felt the weight of the silence pressing in on me again, the heaviness of it settling in my chest. I wasn't going to sit here forever, not waiting for him to notice, not waiting for an apology that would never come. I had to move. I had to do something for myself, something that wasn't tied to him or to us. I stood up, the motion feeling foreign, like I wasn't quite sure of my body's movements. I left some change on the table, not even looking at the barista as I walked out. There was no point in making any small talk, no point in pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. Outside, the air was cold, sharper than it had been earlier, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I had no plan. I didn't know what the next step was, but I knew something had to change, and it wasn't going to be him. I had to start over, just like the note said. But where do you begin, when everything you thought you knew has fallen apart? How do you rebuild yourself when the pieces have scattered so far? I walked down the street without a destination in mind, the sounds of the city a distant hum in my ears. I didn't need to hear anything. I needed to think. And yet, the more I tried to focus, the more the thoughts slipped away, dissolving. Like smoke in the wind? The only thing that was clear was that I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for him to come back, waiting for him to fix it. He wasn't coming back. He had already checked out, and I was the one left holding onto a thread that was fraying with each passing minute. I found myself at a park, sitting on a bench, watching the few people who were out, bundled up in scarves and jackets, enjoying the crisp air. It seemed so simple, so peaceful. But there was no peace for me. No peace for someone who had to pick up the pieces of their life and try to make sense of it all. I stared at my phone again, half expecting to see a message from him, but there was nothing. No apology, no explanation. I wasn't surprised. Not really. But that didn't make it any easier. It didn't make it any less painful. I stood up again, pushing the weight of the moment off my shoulders, and walked away from the bench. I wasn't sure where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. It was time to start over, even if I didn't know how. It's strange, isn't it? How the silence between two people can become louder than any argument. How, in the absence of words, you can hear everything that's left unsaid. That's how the days felt now. A constant hum of unspoken things hanging between us like a thick fog clouding everything. I couldn't bring myself to call him. I couldn't face hearing his voice, not after everything. And maybe I didn't want to. Maybe I needed the silence, needed the space to think clearly for the first time in years. I spent the next few days in a kind of numbness. I went through the motions, eating, working, even talking to people, but everything felt distant, as though I was watching my own life unfold from the other side of a window. There was no real connection, not with anyone, not even with myself. I was still reeling from the shock of it all, the betrayal that had suddenly shattered the life I'd built with him. I found myself wandering through the apartment, unable to sit still. I'd always been the type of person to get restless when things were off, but this was different. I wasn't restless because I was bored or anxious. I was restless because I was trapped in this limbo, this strange in-between place where nothing felt solid, where everything I thought I knew had dissolved. The apartment, our apartment, was still there. Still the same furniture, the same pictures on the wall, but it felt like a ghost of what it used to be. Every room felt like a memory I couldn't touch, like trying to hold onto something that was already slipping away. I sat in the living room one evening, staring at the empty space where he should have been. The TV was off, the air still. It had always been our habit to curl up together after work, watching whatever nonsense we could find. But now, it was just me, alone in the dark, with only my thoughts for company. The silence was maddening. Thought about the lipstick on his shirt, the one thing I had seen with my own eyes that confirmed everything I had feared. But I still hadn't confronted him. I had no intention of doing so. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. The note on the mirror kept playing in my mind. Your turn to start over. Was that what I was doing? Was this my moment to rebuild? To walk away from the wreckage and make something new? But how? Where did I start? I had no answers, no direction, just a deep sense of emptiness. I spent the next few days gathering my things, the ones that were still mine. Slowly but surely, I started pulling out the bits and pieces that had somehow gotten mixed in with his. Photos, clothes, random items that were distinctly mine. It was like reclaiming a small part of myself, piece by piece, in a space that no longer felt like home. I packed some of my things into a bag and left the apartment for a while. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away. To breathe in air that didn't carry the weight of the past 2 years. I walked aimlessly through the city, taking in the sights, the sounds, the pulse of life around me. It was all so vibrant, so alive, and yet I felt disconnected from it. The people around me seemed to be living their own stories, their own lives, unaware of the storm that was swirling inside me. It was then that I realized I wasn't just leaving the apartment. I was leaving that version of myself behind too. The person who had been with him, who had believed in everything we had. That person no longer existed. I was becoming someone new, but I wasn't sure who yet. I had no idea what the next step would be, but I knew I couldn't keep waiting. Waiting for him to come back, waiting for some sign that everything would be okay. That wasn't going to happen. I had to make my own way forward, even if I didn't have a map. I sat on a bench in a park, pulling my coat tighter around me against the evening chill. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the world wash over me, grounding me. I had no answers yet, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of not knowing. Maybe the not knowing was the point. It's funny how things start to feel different once you start taking control. There's this odd sense of power, but it's not a comfortable power. It's the kind that makes your chest tighten, makes every step feel like you're walking on uneven ground. But still, it's power. And it's mine. The days blurred together, but they had a rhythm now. I woke up, I ate, I went through the motions. I still had the same routines, the same chores to get through, but there was a space where something used to be, where a person used to be. And no matter how much I tried to fill that space with tasks or distractions, it remained hollow. I went to work every day, kept my head down, and did what needed to be done. But all the while, I was constantly aware of this absence. The absence of him. The absence of us. The absence of everything I thought my life had been. I was surrounded by people, colleagues, friends, but I felt like an outsider. The conversations felt distant, like I was hearing them from far away. I didn't want to explain myself, not yet, and I didn't want to hear anyone else's opinions about what I should be doing. I wasn't ready for advice, not from anyone. I needed to find my own way to figure this out on my own. One afternoon, I ran into a mutual friend of ours. She was pleasant, of course, but there was an uncomfortable hesitation in her voice when she spoke. She was trying to be kind, trying not to ask questions that were too personal, but I could feel the weight of them in her words. "How are you doing?" she asked, her eyes scanning me, looking for signs of something, anything. "I'm fine," I replied. It was the easiest answer, the simplest one, but it wasn't the truth. I wasn't fine, I wasn't anything. I was just getting through each day, one foot in front of the other. We exchanged pleasantries, and then she left, no doubt carrying the same questions in her mind that everyone else did. The same questions I couldn't answer. The same questions I didn't have answers to. The truth was, I didn't know what was next. I didn't know how long I was going to stay in this suspended state of uncertainty. But one thing was certain, I couldn't keep waiting. Waiting for him to come back. Waiting for an apology. Waiting for something that would somehow make everything right again. That wasn't going to happen. And the more I thought about it, the angrier it made me. The more I realized how much I had allowed myself to be dragged into a life that wasn't mine, a life where I had to wait for someone else to make decisions, to make things happen. But not anymore. I went home that evening, and as I stood in front of the empty apartment, I felt something stir inside me. It wasn't quite anger. It wasn't quite sadness either. It was a strange mix of both, and it made me want to do something, to make a decision, to take action, to stop waiting. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the quiet. I could almost hear his voice in the back of my mind, the way it used to be, but it was faint, fading. And then, just like that, I walked into the bedroom and started packing. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I wasn't staying here. I wasn't going to stay in the place that had once felt like home, but now felt like a cage. I grabbed my things, just the essentials, the things I couldn't leave behind. My clothes, my books, the small trinkets that had once meant something to me. I didn't need anything else. Everything else was just a reminder of him, a reminder of what I had lost. The last thing I took was the sticky note, "Your turn to start over." It was strange to look at it again, after everything, but it felt fitting, like it was meant to be there. A kind of signpost, a marker of a moment in time that I would look back on later and realize had changed. Everything. But I wasn't going to look back. Not now. I had to keep moving forward. As I zipped up my bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving a part of myself behind. But maybe that was the point. Maybe that was what I had to do. I had to leave behind the person who had let herself be defined by him. The person who had lived in his shadow, waiting for him to decide when she was enough. I wasn't that person anymore. I grabbed my keys, opened the door, and stepped out into the night. The world felt big and wide and full of possibility. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the future. It wasn't until I hit the road that I started to feel the weight lift from my chest. The city stretched out before me, a tangle of lights and possibilities, and I drove without any particular destination in mind. The car hummed beneath me, the steady rhythm of the engine almost soothing. It was the kind of quiet I'd been craving, the kind I'd forgotten existed, the kind that only came when you stepped away from everything that had once felt like yours. The streets felt unfamiliar now, even though they had been part of my life for years. But it didn't matter. I wasn't trying to find anything. I wasn't trying to hold on to anything. I was just going. I hadn't planned on leaving the apartment, not like this. I hadn't planned on waking up one morning and deciding I was done. But something had shifted inside me, a shift that I couldn't ignore anymore. It was like I had finally found the courage to ask myself, why are you still here? Why are you still waiting? I wasn't waiting for him. I wasn't waiting for an apology or for him to come back. I had spent so much of my life waiting. For him to make the first move, to make things right, that I had forgotten how to make things right for myself. And this empty space inside me was my wake-up call. As the city lights blurred behind me, I remembered all the times I'd told myself I couldn't leave, that I had to stay, that it would all work out in the end. But the truth was, I had been holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. I had been clinging to a relationship that was already gone, and in doing so, I had lost myself somewhere along the way. I found a small diner on the outskirts of town, its neon sign, flickering in the dark. The warm glow from inside promised comfort, a little bit of peace. I parked the car and walked inside, the bell above the door chiming as I entered. The diner was quiet, save for the low hum of a jukebox playing in the corner. A few late night diners sat at the counter, but no one paid me any mind. I slid into a booth by the window and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I felt free, but also hollow. There was this strange feeling that came with letting go of something so big, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing if I should take a step forward or back, but I wasn't going back. A waitress, mid-40s, with a smile that seemed more knowing than it should have been, approached the table. She had that easygoing, no-nonsense vibe, like she had seen it all before. "What can I get you?" she asked, her eyes scanning me briefly before returning to the menu. "I'll have coffee, please." "Black." She nodded, scribbling it down. "Coming right up." As she walked away, I let my gaze drift to the window, watching the world pass by. The lights outside were brighter here, the streets wider, the noise louder. But it didn't feel as suffocating as it had back in the city. There was space here. There was room to breathe. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I didn't know where I was headed, or how long I would be on the road. But for the First time in a long time, I didn't need to know. I had stopped trying to predict the future, to plan every step of my life around someone else's expectations. I was here, and that was enough. The waitress returned with my coffee, placing the cup in front of me with a knowing smile. I could see the way she sized me up, as if she knew exactly what had led me to this booth, this moment. But she didn't ask. She didn't pry. She just gave me my coffee and walked away. And in that, there was something oddly comforting. I took a sip, the bitterness of the coffee, a welcome contrast to the sweetness of the freedom that was beginning to seep into my bones. This was my life now. This was the beginning of something new, even if I didn't know exactly what that was yet. The night felt endless, full of possibility. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was moving, and that was enough. It's strange how quickly everything can change. You can spend years living a certain way, holding on to a life you've crafted for yourself, and then one day, without any warning, the shift happens. And it's not dramatic. It's not loud. It's quiet. It's that moment when you realize that what you thought you needed isn't actually what you want. I drove for hours, passing through towns and roads I didn't recognize, listening to nothing but the sound of my thoughts. It wasn't peaceful at first. It was chaos, a storm of what-ifs and doubts swirling inside my head. But somewhere, miles away from where I'd started, the storm started to calm. I found myself no longer questioning what had happened or why I had done it. I stopped feeling like I had made a mistake. When I left with purpose. Even if that purpose wasn't clear at the time, I wasn't running away from him. I was running towards something. I had to figure out what that something was. For so long, I had been living in the shadows of other people's expectations, his, my family's, everyone's. But now I was facing the sun. For the first time, I was the one deciding which direction to take. I stopped at a petrol station and filled the car, the smell of gasoline heavy in the air. As I waited for the pump to finish, I glanced at the receipt, noticing the date. It had been exactly 1 week since I'd left him, since I'd walked away without a word, without even a glance back. 1 week. It felt like both no time at all and a lifetime. The fact that I hadn't heard from him yet and was almost a relief. The silence between us was palpable. I half expected him to show up at the door, to beg me to come back, to apologize. But no, he hadn't. Part of me expected guilt to creep in, but it didn't. I didn't feel sorry for him. I didn't feel sorry for myself either. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about recognizing that we had both been stuck in a cycle. One that neither of us had been brave enough to break. I got back into the car, the engine turning over with an ease that felt almost foreign to me. And yet, there was something comforting in it. I didn't have a destination. I didn't need one. I was going wherever the road would take me. The city had been my home for years, but now it felt like nothing more than a memory, a place I used to belong. There was a freedom in the unknown that I hadn't anticipated. There was no one to answer to, no one to explain myself to. I could just be. I thought about the apartment, the empty spaces in the rooms where we had once been, the half-eaten meals left on the table, the books left half-read. But the strangest part was that I didn't miss any of it. Not the stuff, not the routine, not even him. The hardest part wasn't walking away from him. It was walking away from the person I thought I had to be to make everything work. The version of myself I had constructed to fit into the life I thought I was supposed to live. But here I was, alone in the car, driving away, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was starting over. I wasn't running from anything. I was running towards me, towards the parts of myself I had forgotten, or buried, or never even knew existed. I drove past the familiar landmarks, but none of them held any weight anymore. The streets, the shops, the neighborhoods, it was all just scenery now. It was all just background noise in the story of my life. I wasn't sure where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. I didn't need to know. The road stretched out ahead of me, wide open, endless. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to control it. I didn't need to plan the next move. I could just keep driving, keep going, and see where I ended. Up. The further I drove, the more the weight of the past began to lift. I didn't have to explain myself to anyone anymore. There was no one waiting for me to be someone I wasn't. The ache of leaving had dulled, replaced with something I hadn't anticipated. Peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. Not to him, not to my friends, not to the version of myself I had been pretending to be. It was just me. The radio played softly in the background, but I didn't really hear the songs. They were just there, filling the silence in a way that felt comforting. There was no pressure to make small talk, no expectation to pretend I was anything other than what I was. The only thing I had to do now was listen to myself. The road ahead was long, but somehow it didn't seem daunting. It was more like a blank canvas, waiting for me to fill it in however I wanted. The choice was mine, and that felt incredibly powerful. I'd always thought that the hardest part would be walking away, but that wasn't it. The hardest part was realizing that I'd been living in someone else's shadow for far too long. That I had spent so much time trying to make someone else's dream work, I had forgotten to make mine. The car hummed steadily beneath me, and I found myself driving without thinking. I wasn't lost. I was free. I could go anywhere, do anything. I pulled into a small, quiet town in the middle of nowhere, just to stretch my legs. It was a sleepy place, with old brick buildings and streets that seemed to have no particular direction. I wandered down one of the narrow alleys, feeling the heat of the sun on my skin. I didn't have a plan, but that was part of the appeal. The shop windows were dusty, the sidewalks empty. It felt like no one had lived here for years, but I liked it. It was untouched by expectations, untouched by anyone's gaze. I stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. There was something comforting about this place, like it didn't matter who I was or what I had done. Here, I could just be another face in the crowd, or no face at all. I wandered into a small bookstore tucked away in the corner. The smell of old paper and leather hit me as I opened the door, and I breathed it in deeply. The quiet was almost deafening, but it was the kind of silence that felt safe. The kind of silence that didn't demand anything from you. I picked up a book off the shelf, letting my fingers trace the worn cover. It was about travel, about people who left everything behind to go somewhere new, somewhere unknown. It struck a chord with me. Maybe that's what I needed to do. Not just leave him, but leave everything behind. The life I had built, the person I had become. I needed to explore not just the world, but myself. I bought the book, paid with cash, and slipped it into my bag. It was a small, quiet victory, a reminder that I was still in control. I could choose the next chapter, and I didn't need anyone else's approval to do it. When I stepped out of the bookstore, the sun had started to set. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I could breathe. The world didn't feel so heavy anymore. I didn't feel so lost. I walked back to the car, my steps light. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring or where I would end up, but that was okay. I didn't need to know. I was writing my own story now. The following morning, I woke up. Before the sun had risen, the faint glow of dawn creeping through the window, I was used to waking up with a sense of dread, the weight of the day ahead pressing down on me before I even got out of bed. But today, there was nothing. The silence was soothing, a stark contrast to the chaotic mornings I used to have. There was no rush, no expectations. The world was still, and I was still with it. I sat up, stretching my arms above my head, feeling the soft creak of my joints. For the first time in ages, I didn't feel like I had to run. No one was waiting for me to do something. No one was depending on me. There was no one to disappoint. It felt foreign, like I was stepping into a life I had always known existed, but never quite dared to enter. The unknown was no longer a source of fear. It was an opportunity to take control in a way I had never been able to before. I brushed my teeth, stood under a hot shower, and dressed myself in something that didn't need to be anything. I hadn't unpacked much when I left, just a bag of essentials and a few clothes I had thrown together. I didn't have a destination. I didn't have a plan. The fact that I was even able to walk away from the life I had built without a second thought amazed me. It wasn't just the house or the car that were gone, it was the version of myself that had become tied to them. The woman who cared more about appearances than truth, the woman who stayed in a relationship out of convenience, out of fear of being alone. Now, I was alone, and it didn't feel like a punishment. It was a relief. I drove through the town, letting the unfamiliarity wash over me. Every turn felt like a new path opening up in front of me. But I couldn't ignore the strange tug in my chest. I had to face it. I missed him. Or at least, I missed the idea of him. The version of him that existed in my mind. The one who had promised things that were never kept. The one I had fooled myself into believing was who I needed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been chasing a fantasy. I wasn't grieving him. I was grieving the life I thought we were supposed to have. I passed the gas station where we'd once stopped on our way to a weekend. Getaway. I remembered how he'd bought me a bottle of water and made some dumb joke about how it was the most romantic thing he could afford. I had laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that lingered in my heart. It was forced, just like everything else had been. I drove a little farther, stopping at a quiet diner for breakfast. The small yellowed sign outside read Joe's Diner in chipped red paint. It wasn't much, but I didn't need much. Just something to fill the quiet space in my mind. The Sammy's booth was small, tucked in the corner near the window, and I slid into it, staring out at the empty street. I wasn't hungry, but I ordered pancakes anyway. The waitress, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, took my order without speaking too much. She didn't ask questions. She didn't care why I was sitting there alone, and I was grateful for that. As I waited, I found myself staring at my phone. For a split second, I thought about calling him. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the lingering memories that still clung to my mind. But I stopped myself. I didn't need to do that. I didn't need to slip back into the comfort of the past. I was building something new, something different. When the pancakes arrived, I pushed them around on my plate without really eating. I felt no hunger, just a strange sort of emptiness. It was the kind of emptiness you feel when you've shed something heavy, but it still lingers in your bones. The weight of solitude was starting to feel real now. It wasn't easy. It wasn't peaceful. But it was necessary. I didn't know how long I'd stay in this town or what my next move would be. But for now, I was exactly where I needed to be. Alone. The days started to blur together after that, and I felt the weight of every minute dragging me through a haze. It wasn't a sadness, not exactly. More like an emptiness, a space that once held so much and was now vacant. I hadn't realized how suffocating it had been, living in the shadow of something that wasn't real. I went to the local library, searching for something to occupy my mind. The quiet was almost suffocating in its own way. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers over the spines of books. Fiction, history, poetry, nothing stood out. But then, on a shelf in the back corner, I found a worn-out journal. It wasn't much to look at, just a plain leather cover, cracked and faded. But there was something about it that drew me in. Maybe it was the fact that it looked so abandoned, forgotten, much like me. I picked it up, feeling the texture of the cover under my fingertips, and flipped it open. The first page was blank, the second was empty as well. But as I moved through the pages, I realized they were filled with small, neat handwriting. The entries were from someone who had been lost in thought, not unlike me. The words were simple, but there was an honesty to them that felt familiar. The journal was full of little moments, observations about the world around the writer, thoughts on life, musings about their future. It was nothing extraordinary, but there was something raw about it. It was real, in a way I hadn't felt in so long. I sat down at a table, clutching the journal as though it held some kind of secret I had to uncover. I read through it slowly, page after page, until I was lost in it. There was something comforting about the anonymity of it, as if the writer was a stranger who understood me more than anyone else ever had. The truth began to sink in as I read those pages. I had been running from something for so long, running from the truth, running from myself. I had convinced myself that leaving was an escape, but all I had done was start a new chapter in a life that was just as uncertain as the one I had left behind. The problem wasn't him. It wasn't even the life we had built. The problem was that I had never given myself the chance to exist without the weight of someone else's expectations. I had tied my worth to someone else's approval, and in doing so, I had lost track of who I was. I put the journal down, staring at the pages as though they held the answers to everything I had been asking myself. But the truth was, they didn't. There was no neat conclusion, no clean resolution. Life wasn't a story that could be neatly wrapped up. I closed the journal, holding it against my chest for a moment. It wasn't the answers I needed. It was the willingness to ask the right questions, to face the uncertainty instead of running from it. I walked back to my car, my thoughts swirling. The road ahead was still unclear, but maybe that was the point. Maybe it was time to stop trying to control everything, to stop searching for a way to make sense of it all. For the first time in a long while, I felt something that could almost pass for peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that settled your mind or made everything okay. It was the kind of peace that allowed you to accept the chaos without needing to fix it. As I drove away from the library, I realized I wasn't looking for a home anymore. I wasn't searching for a place to settle. I was searching for something deeper, something inside me that had always been there, but had been buried under the weight of expectations and fear. Maybe I wasn't meant to have all the answers right now. Maybe the only thing I needed was the courage to keep moving forward. There was a moment, somewhere between the days and the nights, when everything felt still. It wasn't peaceful, no, not at all, but it was a silence that weighed on me. It wrapped itself around my thoughts and squeezed until I couldn't breathe, but I didn't know how to escape it. I'd been to the apartment again, but this time, I didn't go inside. I stood at the door, my hand hovering over the knob, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it. There was something about it that felt so final. The idea of stepping back into that space felt like I was reopening a wound I'd already tried to forget. Instead, I just stood there, looking at the door, as though it might somehow open itself and show me the answers I was looking for. But it didn't. The sticky note on the mirror, the one that had felt like a lifeline when I'd first read it, now seemed like a distant memory. Your turn to start over. It haunted me, but not in the way I thought it would. At first I thought I'd be angry. Maybe I should have been, but there was no rage left in me, just an overwhelming sense of nothingness. And somehow, that was worse. I sat in the car for hours, staring at the apartment building from the street. A soft drizzle of rain had started to fall, and the sound of it hitting the windows added to the suffocating quiet. I wasn't sure if I was waiting for something, or if I was just stalling from whatever decision I needed to make next. I thought about everything that had happened in the last few weeks. The lipstick on his shirt, the silence that followed, the coldness that had seeped into every corner of my life. It felt like the world had shifted and I was still standing, frozen, waiting for it to go back to what it was before. But I knew it wouldn't. The truth was, I had been avoiding the hardest part, the part where I had to admit that this was never about him. It had always been about me, my need to escape, my need to leave, my need to finally take control of my life, even if it meant losing everything in the process. The hardest thing about starting over wasn't the uncertainty or the fear. It was the realization that, in the end, it wasn't about him. It was never about him. It was about me deciding to stop living for someone else. And yet, as much as I tried to convince myself that this was the right thing, I couldn't help but wonder, was I truly ready to let go of everything? Was I ready to let go of him? Of all the years we spent together, of the moments we shared, even the smallest ones that seemed so insignificant at the time. The rain picked up, tapping against the roof of the car, and I realized I hadn't even noticed that I was crying. I wiped the tears away, but they kept coming. Maybe this was the moment, I thought. The moment where I had to stop pretending, Stop pretending that I could move on without acknowledging the truth. I wasn't ready. Not yet. But I would be. Eventually. The Wapbe rain slowed to a gentle patter, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something resembling hope. It wasn't a grand revelation. It wasn't some grand plan for the future. It was just the quiet recognition that, in time, I would learn how to breathe again. But first, I had to let go. It's strange how time can stretch, bend, and twist, all without you realizing it. 1 minute, it's the end of the week, and the next, days have passed, and nothing has changed. Not really. Not in a way that you can pinpoint. You just keep moving, one foot in front of the other, waiting for something to shift, something to give. But nothing does. I kept going back to the apartment just to stare at it from the outside. Sometimes I didn't even get out of the car. I'd park across the street and just sit there, watching the lights in the windows flicker as the evening sun sank lower, casting everything in an amber glow. The world felt too quiet, too still. Even the city outside the car window seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. A sign, maybe. Some sort of confirmation that this was the right choice. That this strange limbo I had created for myself would lead to something new, something better. Or perhaps I was just clinging to the last remnants of a life I no longer recognized, not ready to face the fact that I was entirely alone in this new reality. But even that, being alone, didn't feel as heavy as I thought it would. Not at first. There was a sense of relief in the silence, an absence of tension that I hadn't realized had been there all along. And maybe, just maybe, this quiet was what I needed. The space to think, to breathe, to feel the weight of my own choices, and how they had led me here. It wasn't until one night, long after I'd returned home from another day of wandering aimlessly, that I realized what had been missing all along. Closure. I had thought that walking away, leaving everything behind, would be enough. But the truth was, I hadn't really left. Not completely. It was funny, really. I had been so focused on the aftermath of everything, the lipstick, the note, the apartment, that I had forgotten the importance of what came before it all. The years we spent together, the moments that built up to this breaking point, were still there, floating in my mind like forgotten fragments of a dream. Maybe I had always known deep down that this was going to happen. I couldn't keep ignoring the cracks that had been forming, the little things that I had brushed aside, the late nights, the distance, the silence that crept in between us, slowly and surely, until it became something I couldn't ignore anymore. But I never said anything. I never asked the hard questions, never faced the truth when it first presented itself. I had let things slip, thinking that if I kept quiet long enough, things would just fix themselves. I guess I was wrong about that. In the dark, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and realized something. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. It was almost as though that anger had burnt itself out, leaving only ashes behind. I wasn't mad at him. I wasn't mad at myself either. I was just done. And maybe that's all closure really is. Not some grand confrontation or dramatic moment of realization, but simply the quiet acceptance that things are the way they are, and that's all there is to it. I didn't know where I would go from here. I didn't have a plan. But for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the crushing weight of uncertainty. For once, I felt free. The morning I went back to the apartment, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I had driven there without thinking, the autopilot of my body carrying me along as my mind stayed distant. By now, I had done this enough times for it to feel almost like a ritual. Park outside, sit for a few moments in the car, stare at the familiar windows, and then drive away. But today felt different. I didn't have an excuse. I didn't tell myself I was going to check on things or just see how it looked. I had no agenda this time, no plan to leave as quickly as I arrived. I just knew I had to be there. I stood in front of the door, hesitating. The key still hung in my pocket. It felt strange to have it there, but I still didn't know how to let it go. The door had been locked the last time I came. This time, when I turned the handle, the door opened with ease, as though it had been waiting for me. It was the same apartment, but it felt empty in a way I couldn't describe. The space seemed smaller, even though I knew it wasn't. The silence pressed in on me like an oppressive weight. I walked inside, slowly, almost reverently. The smell of the place had changed too. I couldn't place it. There was no lingering scent of his cologne, or the faint trace of coffee in the air. Instead, there was just the cold, sterile scent of a place that had been abandoned. I let my fingers trail along the edge of the kitchen counter, the surface smooth under my touch. The place was too clean, too perfect. Nothing had been left behind. No forgotten sweatshirt, no stray socks, no reminders of the life we had built together. It was as if it had all been erased, scrubbed away until nothing remained but the bare walls. I wandered through the rooms, each step echoing in the hollow emptiness. The living room, the bedroom, the bathroom, each one felt as though it had never belonged to anyone. It didn't feel like my home, not anymore, and it certainly didn't feel like his. But there, in the middle of the room, was a small, unassuming object, the photo frame that had sat on the mantel. I hadn't expected to see it, and yet there it was, as though it had never moved. I stepped closer, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The photo inside was one of the few we had taken together in the beginning, smiling at the camera like we had all the time in the world. His arm wrapped around my shoulders, our faces close, and I couldn't help but remember that moment. The feeling of being so sure that this was everything we'd ever need, so full of hope and love, unaware of what was to come. I set the frame down, my heart suddenly heavy. It felt as though the memory was mocking me, reminding me of everything I had lost, everything I had walked away from. But it was just a photo. After all, it wasn't real. It couldn't hold on to me the way I seemed to be holding on to it. Turning away from the frame, I glanced at the rest of the apartment one last time. It was empty. There was nothing here anymore. Not for me, not for him. Just four walls and a cold silence. I walked out, locking the door behind me. And just like that, I was alone again. It's strange how quickly you can go from being convinced that you've fully processed something to feeling like you're back at square one. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, and all I could think about was the photo. That stupid photo. It was as if seeing it had triggered something in me, something that had been lying dormant, buried under all the layers of anger and hurt. I wasn't ready for it. I wasn't ready for the feeling of longing that crept in when I saw that image of us. But then again, maybe I was never meant to be ready for it. Maybe I was meant to feel this way, to let this sadness take over for a while, because if I didn't, what would be left? Nothing but a harsh, empty truth. I took a deep breath and looked at myself in the rearview mirror. I didn't know who was staring back at me. The woman in the mirror was familiar and strange all at once. She looked like me, but somehow she didn't feel like me. She was someone who had been through something, but had yet to come out the other side. She was someone whose identity had been reshaped by a man who had promised to love her, a man who had, quite clearly, failed in that promise. I wasn't going to cry. I had cried enough. I'd shed enough tears over the last few months to fill a river, but no matter how many times I let the tears fall, they didn't wash anything away. They didn't bring me any closer to finding peace. What I didn't expect was to find this softness, this tenderness. It was like an old part of me that had been buried deep beneath layers of resentment and disillusionment was slowly beginning to unfurl. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to welcome it back. If I let myself feel this way, would I be allowing myself to become weak? To become vulnerable again? The thought made me uncomfortable, so I shoved it aside. I was stronger than this, I told myself. I wasn't someone who needed to fall apart every time the past decided to show its ugly face. No, I had made my decision. I was moving on. But still, I found myself reaching for my phone. I unlocked the screen and hovered over his name, my thumb trembling ever so slightly. I didn't want to call him. I didn't want to reach out. I had done that too many times before. But this time, it felt like something different, like there was a part of me that was begging for answers, something that didn't quite understand why he had left things the way they were. But then I remembered the sticky note, the note he had left, as though handing me the baton to keep running this race alone. Your turn to start over. That was his final message to me, a note that, in some twisted way, had given me the permission to move on. And maybe, just maybe, that was the key to my freedom. I swiped my thumb away from the screen and locked my phone. No, this wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. It was time to stop searching for something that wasn't there. With that thought, I put the car in gear and drove off. The apartment felt emptier than it ever had before, even though I was alone. It was strange how a space could feel so alive when someone else was there, and yet, when they were gone, it could become a ghost of what it once was. I didn't even know where to begin. The things we had shared here, this space, these moments, suddenly felt foreign, like a dream that had lost its clarity. I walked through the rooms, each step echoing in the quiet. It felt like I was in someone else's home, and yet it was mine, or at least it had been. I wandered into the kitchen, my eyes landing on the coffee mug he used to drink from every morning, the one with the chipped edge, the one I had teased him about for weeks. He never bothered to replace it, always claiming that it added character. Now, it was just a reminder of something that was gone. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, and for a moment I could almost hear his laugh, but it was fleeting, just a whisper of the past. I set the mug down gently and moved to the living room. The couch was still in the same place, the cushions slightly dented where we used to sit. I had spent so many evenings here, curled up with him, watching our favorite shows, sharing our thoughts, our quiet moments. Now, it all felt like a distant memory, something that belonged to a version of me that I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. The wall next to the couch still had the photo of us from our trip to Paris. It was taken on a rainy afternoon, the kind where you couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. We were drenched, our clothes clinging to our skin, but we didn't care. We just laughed. It was a memory I thought would always make me smile. But now, it felt like a weight I could barely bear. I reached out and touched the frame. It was odd how these things, these objects, could hold so much meaning, so much emotion. But now, every single one of them was a trigger, a constant reminder of what had been lost. I sighed and dropped my hand back to my side. I wasn't sure if I wanted to stay here, surrounded by these echoes of a life I thought I understood. But then again, I wasn't ready to leave yet. Something kept me tethered, like a part of me was still holding on, unwilling to completely sever the last connection. I stepped away from the photo and walked over to the window. The city outside was bustling, people going about their daily lives, unaware of the inner storm I was weathering. I watched as the light shifted, casting shadows across the street below. The world outside moved on, oblivious to my heartache, and yet I couldn't bring myself to move. I was stuck in this in-between space, neither here nor there, caught between the past and whatever came next. What came next? I glanced back at the apartment, the space I had once shared with him, and realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about me, about learning to fill the silence. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring out the window, but eventually, I turned and walked toward the door. I had no destination in mind, no plan, just the need to move, to do something. And as I stepped into the hallway, I made a promise to myself. The next time I walked into this apartment, it would be different. It would be mine again. The air in the hallway felt thick, heavy with the remnants of what had been. I stood there for a moment, half expecting the door to swing open, for him to walk out and say something, anything, that would pull me back into the comfort of the known. But nothing. Just the quiet hum of the building, the sound of my own breath filling the empty space. I stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor without much thought. The journey down felt slower than usual, as if the building itself was reluctant to let me leave. I leaned against the wall, arms folded, trying to steady my mind. Where was I going? What was I supposed to do now? The city outside was alive, bustling with the energy of people who had somewhere to be, something to do. I watched as the streets blurred by, the headlights of cars cutting through the dimming light. It was a stark contrast to the stillness I felt inside. The elevator finally dinged, and I stepped out into the lobby. My footsteps echoed in the vast, empty space. The building was quiet, but I could hear the faint murmur of voices in the distance, the low hum of activity that seemed so far removed from where I was. I stood at the door, my hand on the handle, and felt a pang of hesitation. I wasn't ready to face the world outside, not yet, but I couldn't stay in the apartment, couldn't let myself drown in the suffocating silence. I stepped out into the street, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. The weight in my chest seemed to lift a little as I breathed in deeply, feeling the fresh air fill my lungs. I needed space, needed distance from everything, from him, from the apartment, from the memories. I walked without purpose, my feet carrying me through the familiar streets. I passed the usual shops, the cafe where we used to sit on Sundays, the park where we had spent hours watching the sunset. Each place was a landmark of a life that was no longer mine, a map of the past that I wasn't sure I wanted to follow anymore. The further I walked, the more detached I felt from everything. It was as if the world had continued moving without me, and I was just an observer, watching it all pass by. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to chase after it. I didn't need to be a part of it. I stopped at a bench in the park, sitting down slowly, letting the quiet of the space settle around me. The trees rustled in the wind, their leaves shimmering in the fading light. It was peaceful here almost, surreal, like time had slowed just for me. I closed my eyes, letting the sounds of the world wash over me. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, or if I was even looking at all. All I knew was that I needed this space, this moment to breathe, to exist without the weight of the past pressing down on me. I thought about the sticky note, about the words he had left me. Your turn to start over. The note had been simple, but it felt like a verdict, like an instruction, as if he had already moved on, already decided what came next. But the truth was, I didn't need him to decide. I could do it on my own. I could figure out what came next, even if it was unclear. The wind picked up, and I pulled my coat tighter around me, a small shiver running through me. But I didn't stand up. I didn't leave. I just sat there, letting the quiet fill me up until I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, but eventually, I stood. I didn't know where I was going, but I had a sense that it didn't matter. I was moving forward, even if I didn't know where the road would lead. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The next morning felt different, heavier, lighter, in ways I couldn't fully explain. I woke up early, before the sun had fully risen, the light creeping in through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the room. It was quiet, too quiet, but it was my quiet. No phone buzzing, no footsteps, no sounds of the coffee machine whirring to life, just silence. I had moved on from the apartment. That wasn't to say the memories weren't still there, lurking in the corners, in the cracks of the walls, the places where we had once shared our lives. But now, it was just me in that space. Me alone with the thoughts that had lingered too long. I had learned to be okay with the emptiness, the absence of all the things that had filled it once. The sticky note was still tucked in my coat pocket, and I hadn't thrown it away, though part of me had wanted to. It was an anchor, a reminder of where things had ended, but also a mark of where things could begin. I had been holding on to it, unsure of what it meant. Maybe that was what I needed all along, to stop letting him, or anyone, dictate the terms of my future. I had found my own terms slowly, carefully, through the quiet, through the absence. There had been no confrontation, no angry words, just the finality of the silence, the space that had once been ours, now entirely mine. I stood up from the bed, stretching, feeling the weight of the night lifting off me. It was time to move on. Had planned to leave the apartment for good a few days ago, but something had kept me here. Something unresolved, a nagging doubt that hadn't quite let me go. But today, I was sure. I didn't need any more closure, didn't need any grand gestures or explanations. I was done seeking permission to live my life on my own terms. I packed the last of my things into a bag, each item feeling like a final chapter of a book I didn't want to revisit. The sound of zippers closing, the rustling of clothes, the faint click of the lock on the door. It all felt like the closing of a door that had been open far too long. It was a soft sound, but it resonated, carrying with it the weight of everything I had let go. As I stepped into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind me, I took a deep breath, as if stepping into a new world. It wasn't just about leaving the apartment. It wasn't just about leaving him. It was about leaving the version of me that had been held back by what-ifs, by insecurities, by fear of the unknown. There was a quiet thrill in the uncertainty. I didn't know what was coming next, didn't know where I was going, but that didn't matter anymore. I wasn't bound by expectations or by the weight of the past. I was free, and for the first time, I could feel that freedom in every inch of my being. I didn't know what I would do next, where I would go, or who I would become. But I didn't need to know. All I needed was this step, the first one, the hardest one, and then the rest would follow. The city stretched out before me, full of possibilities. It felt different now. Everything felt different. I didn't look back.